Hello again everyone, and here's a lens which I've had a lot of requests to review, and which I've been quite keen to look at for a little while now. The new Sigma 50-100mm f1.8a. That's right, it's a telephoto zoom lens with a fantastically wide maximum aperture of f1.8, meaning it can get nice, fast shutter speeds and very out of focus backgrounds, all while offering the versatility of a zoom function. Very impressive indeed, and certainly a unique piece of kit. Although there are a few downsides to it which are worth mentioning immediately. This lens is designed for aps-c cameras, digital SLR or mirrorless with an adapter. If you try to use it on a full frame camera, then you'll get very heavy vignetting indeed at 50mm and when you zoom in as well. Another disadvantage is that the lens costs over £800 or around $1,100 and for that price you could get a couple of much smaller f1.8 prime lenses and still have spare change. Another disadvantage is that the lens's 50-100mm focal length is only a 2x zoom range. That means it'll be good for portrait and event photography, but too short for wildlife or sports photography. Unless you're talking about indoor sports, I suppose. And the final disadvantage is that the lens is very big and heavy. It's of similar dimensions to a full-frame 70-200mm f2.8 lens. Oh, and the Sigma lens does not have image stabilization. So, for a number of reasons, however impressive this lens turns out to be, you should think very carefully about whether it's the right option for you, particularly if you're thinking of getting a full-frame camera in the future. Anyway, with all that negativity out of the way, let's take a look at the instrument itself. As I mentioned, it is very big and quite heavy, with a beautiful large front element which requires large 82mm filters. The lens feels very solid and built to a high standard. As usual for a modern Sigma lens, full-time manual focus is available and the focus ring works very smoothly and precisely enough. The autofocus motor is fairly quiet and works quite quickly and accurately. It even worked quite quickly in live view mode on my cameras, although video makers will hear a little noise while the lens is autofocusing. The lens's zoom ring is a little stiff, but it does turn evenly and precisely. One issue I noticed with the lens is that its tripod collar seems to be poorly designed. The hole for the screw is not deep enough, which means that on some tripod plates the lens won't fit properly. You may be forced to screw the camera into the tripod instead, which would make your setup poorly balanced. On the whole though, the lens handles well. The lack of image stabilization is a bit of a shame though. Well, this is clearly built to be a professional lens, so let's see if it has image quality to match. I'll be testing it on a 24MP camera, a Canon EOS M3. At 50mm and f1.8, we are seeing very sharp image quality straight away in the middle of the picture. Let's see about the corners. The good news is that they continue to be very sharp, which is a great achievement. The only issue is some pretty noticeable chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. It's strong enough to be noticeable in a lot of pictures where the edges are actually in focus. Stop down to f2.8 and there's an extra boost of sharpness, but even at f4, where we see maximum sharpness, that chromatic aberration is still sticking around. So at 50mm the lens is fantastically sharp, but the colour fringing is a little intrusive. Let's zoom in to 100mm then. In the middle of the image at f1.8, we see very good, although not quite perfect sharpness. Contrast is slightly lower at f1.8 here too, but it's still a nice image. The good news, however, is that we also see very good sharpness indeed in the image corners, and thankfully that chromatic aberration is totally gone. Stop down to f2.8 or f4 for perfect sharpness in the corners and tons of resolution and contrast back in the middle of the image. Overall, in general, the Sigma 50-100 gets top marks for sharpness no matter what you do with it. It always resolves tons of detail and good contrast. My only concern is with the colour fringing at wide angles, but in fairness, you can often remove that in editing. Let's move on and look at distortion and vignetting. At 50mm, we see only negligible barrel distortion and only a little darkness in the corners of the image at f1.8. Stop down to f2.8 and that vignetting is basically gone. If you zoom in to 100mm, we see a moderate amount of pincushion distortion, but that will have the desirable effect of making our subject look a little thinner. At 100mm, the vignetting is more noticeable at f1.8, but still not too bad. Stop down to f2.8 and, again, it's gone. Overall, these are pleasing results for vignetting and distortion. The lens can focus down to about 95cm, about average for a portrait lens, although 50mm prime lenses will get much closer. At f1.8, close-up picture quality is a little ghostly. Stop down to f2.8 though, and that fantastic sharpness returns quickly. When it comes to working against bright light, the lens seems to capitulate and offer little resistance, showing quite some flaring and loss of contrast. That's really not surprising though, considering its large front element and complex optical formula. And finally, bokeh. This thing is a bokeh machine, especially at 100mm and f1.8. Generally, the bokeh is very smooth indeed, no matter what settings you use, which leaves you with some very pleasing images. The only busyness can be seen with very difficult backgrounds which are only slightly out of focus, a stress test though for any lens. Overall, I started this review quite negatively, because admittedly the lens has slightly questionable parameters, but optically, it's really superb and I had a great time actually testing it out in the field. It just churns out beautiful pictures with nice colours and contrast and beautiful out of focus backgrounds. The body of the lens handles really well, even though it's a big piece of kit. You should think very carefully about whether this lens is right for you, or whether you'd prefer a 70 to 200mm f2.8 zoom lens with image stabilization, or a couple of small prime lenses instead. But if you decide that this one is the workhorse lens you've been looking for, then the Sigma 50 to 100mm f1.8 will perform unquestionably, and as such, it comes highly recommended.